land may be dying. Some are looking off-world for a fresh start. The competition for land and resources out here is brutal. In this winner-take-all environment, people are doing anything to succeed.
Offworld Trading Company is an RTS/free market simulator brought to you by Mohawk Games, a fairly new developer headed by Soren Johnson, a video game designer and programmer that worked on Civilization 3 and 4 before forming this new company. So how do you play? Is it any good? This video is meant to function as a review and somewhat basic guide for how the game works. Don't expect any high-level tips on playing this game from this. Offworld Trading Company is a pretty complex game, and it would take much longer than just a 20-minute video to explain all the strategies and mechanics of this game. I've seen this game described as an RTS, and it is to some extent, but that doesn't really capture what it's about. You're fighting over the market, and your ultimate goal isn't to destroy the enemy base, but to drive them out of business. In this game, you're basically Space Gordon Gekko, and your ultimate goal is to drive your competitors out of business and bring the iron fist of capitalism to the Red Planet. You play as, well, an off-world trading company, putting up shop on Mars, and Io or Ceres if you spring for the expansions. Now the game does come with a tutorial section, and it's okay. It'll show you the bare basics of the game, but doesn't really explain much of how to actually play the markets, which is the majority of what you'll be doing in the game. When a game starts, a colony is already set up in the center of the map, and you need to pick where your headquarters are going to go. This decision does have a pretty big impact on your future, as all resources you produce have to be shipped back to your base, which makes more fuel if it's farther away. There are 13 resources in the game. Water, aluminum, silicon, carbon, and iron are raw resources that are extracted from the surface of the planet itself. Steel, food, oxygen, fuel, electronics, chemicals, and glass are resources that are produced by building structures that use up other resources. So essentially, they exchange one or more resources to produce this resource. For instance, if you build a farm, it will spend water and some power to make food. Power is unique in that it is made for free by the building simply existing. Solar panels, wind turbines, and thermal vents that tap into geothermal power. So if you want to play as a Martian Iceland, you can definitely do that. And this is what makes Offworld Trading Company so different from other strategy games. This isn't StarCraft or Company of Heroes, where you can memorize a build order. A strategy that works in one game may be completely wrong in another. You can make a bunch of money with steel mills when everybody else is trying to build glass factories and upgrade their HQs, but in the next game where iron is everywhere and everyone's building steel mills, you'd be killing your chances doing the same thing. Now that we've talked about resources, there's one last decision to be made before you plop your base down, and that's which company you're going to pick from. There are 4 corporations, or 6 if you include the expansion: Scientific, Expansive, Robotic, and Scavenger. Each one plays a bit differently and it would take a long time to go through them all, so let's do that now. Yoshimi Robotics is the robotic corporation. They are unique in that their HQ doesn't require life support. Life support is essentially just a cost of living for the drones in your base. All other companies need a steady supply of food, water, and oxygen to keep their HQ going, and these demands go up as you upgrade your HQ, but as the robots, you don't have to worry about any of that. On top of that, they also don't use fuel. Let me explain fuel quickly. When you build something, be it a mine or a factory, the resources it produces need to be shipped back to your base so it can be sold or used for construction purposes. When a shipment is filled, the transport will automatically pick it up and ship it back. This requires fuel and increases as your buildings are further away from the base. Robots don't need that. They use up energy instead. I found this mechanic to be a bit of an advantage and disadvantage for them. On one hand, they don't have to worry about a pretty large group of resources, but if you choose to ignore them completely, you can be shut out entirely of some potentially profitable deals. You're also more predictable to your opponents, who will have a good idea of what you'll be building if you pick them. The other big standout for these guys is how the adjacency bonus works for them. What this just means is that the same buildings next to each other give bonuses to one another. If you watch people play, you might see a lot of sets of the same buildings arranged in triangles. That's to take advantage of this bonus. For the others, this only applies to the exact same building. So 3 electronics factories will improve each other, but not 2 factories in a mine. For robotics, this bonus applies to buildings that use an input resource that an adjacent building produces. What that means is that if you take an electronics factory, which spends silicon, carbon, power, and aluminum to produce electronics, and place it next to an aluminum, silicon, or carbon mine, or even a power plant, it will receive that same adjacency bonus. Next up are the expansives, and their big thing is building more stuff. They get 1 claim more than others when they upgrade their HQ. Claims are essentially the rights to a hex. You can't just start putting down mines everywhere. All the hexes on the map are owned by the colony in the center, and they will only ration out claims to you either by upgrading your headquarters, buying them on the black market, which I'll get to, or through random auctions. The nice part is you don't even need to build anything right away. You can claim a rich deposit and prevent anybody else from getting it. For most factions, this means you have to be careful about where you're claiming land, but the expansives can be a bit more greedy. This, combined with their emphasis on steel production, makes them a good choice if you want to just lay down mines and steel mills and go nuts on the steel market. This can be dangerous though, everybody needs steel, so don't be surprised if a lot of people do this and drive the price down. Good for you to some extent, since expansives need lots of steel to upgrade, but not so great if you're planning to get rich off it. Expansive transports also move 50% faster, so you don't have to wait as long for resources to come in, even if you build them all the way across the map. All this makes the expansive faction a good balanced choice. You typically can't really go wrong with them. The extra claims and faster transports makes it easier to get a good share of the market. Of course, this also means that there isn't really anything that they excel at in particular. The scientific companies are next stop. Their big benefit is that you can place factories on the raw resources themselves instead of needing to build a mine. So instead of having to build an iron mine and then a steel mill to make steel, scientists can just place a steel mill on an iron resource, and the mill will just take that iron from the hex to make steel. Overall, this is a pretty big bonus, as it can free up your claims quite a bit. Instead of needing 2 claims for an iron mine and a steel mill, you can just use 1 with a steel mill and an iron resource. There are downsides to this though. You're not actually producing that resource, which means that you don't have the opportunity to sell it if it gets expensive. Also, the level of the hex doesn't matter. A high or low iron resource won't have any effect on the steel mill's production. Besides that, they can also acquire patents at a faster rate. Patents are essentially your technology advancements in Offworld Trading Company. They give you special bonuses, and since they're patents, this gives you exclusive access to that bonus. They can do all sorts of stuff from making pleasure domes more profitable to letting you teleport resources instead of using transports. To make patents, you have to build a patent lab, and patents work just like other purchases in Offworld. You can either buy them or use resources, in this case chemicals, to get them. These patents vary from being extremely powerful, like teleportation, to fairly situational, like carbon scrubbing or cold fusion. You need to be careful with patents though. As I said before, they're exclusive, so if someone grabs it before you, you're going to lose any progress you were making on it, and they do take a fairly long time to develop as well. Scavengers are the final of the 4 companies that come with the original version. What really sets these guys apart is carbon. For everybody else, carbon's a pretty easy to forget resource. It's used for making electronics and a few other things, but doesn't have a ton of uses. Scavengers are different though. They use carbon instead of either steel or aluminum for building their structures, and carbon is also the major element in upgrading their HQ too. Suffice it to say, you will want a ton of carbon to succeed as these guys. I'd say this makes this corp pretty situational. If you can find yourself a part of the map with good amounts of carbon, I'd say at least 2 hexes, then they can be a good choice. If you don't have that though, you're going to be relying on others for a resource that forms a cornerstone of your economy. But carbon isn't everything different about the scavengers. They also get faster access to the black market than others. Now that we're on to the scavengers, it's time to talk about the black market. This is the method by which you can screw with the competition. A menu of randomly selected options are made available to you every now and then that let you either help yourself or hurt others. Although you can hurt yourself too if you're so inclined.
Wait, that was good, right? Yeah. Okay, good. I wanted to do that.
Kidding.
Circuits overloaded.
These can be anything from buying an extra claim under the table to blowing up somebody's factory. Be careful though, because if they planted a goon squad on that building, which is another black market option, that not only prevents your action from happening, it also lets them steal your action and use it against you. You'll get a message when one of these actions gets used, and if you miss that, you'll also get a message from a guy with a posh English accent for some reason.
Pirates. I hate those filthy bandits.
So at this point you might be wondering, I know that I'm supposed to make money and sabotage everybody, but how do I win this game? Simple, kind of. You need to engineer a hostile takeover of all your rivals, so you can monopolize the Mars market and thus save humanity, I guess. There's a couple different ways to do that. At the beginning of the game, you own only a fraction of your company, so if another player is quick enough, they can buy up enough of your stocks to give them the majority of your company. When this happens, you'll get a nice pink slip with a usually not very nice severance package, and it's the unemployment line for you. You can prevent this by buying up your own stocks until you own 50%, which effectively locks out that way to buy you out. At that point, the only way for you to lose is for another player to completely buy out your whole company, essentially meaning that they need to have all the money to buy out your whole company at once. To do a complete buyout, you can hold Shift on the Buy Stock button on the top right, and it'll turn red instead of blue. Needless to say, this option can get very expensive, especially at the end of the game. The game will also helpfully let you know when someone has 50% or more of the cash to buy you out. Once that starts getting closer to 100%, you better take steps to stop them, or your next board meeting might involve some unfortunate staffing changes. However, the game doesn't tell you when you have enough money to buy somebody else, so you need to keep an eye on that yourself. You can do that by hovering over the names of your opponents, which also gives you some information on their company. You get a few different choices to play the game. There's a non-linear campaign, typical skirmish mode, and they even recently introduced an infinite challenge mode that gives you progressively harder challenges to beat. The campaign has some interesting mechanics. You get to jump around Mars competing in different colonies. You get to customize what kind of buildings and upgrades you want to bring into each of those missions. You can even upgrade them further so that they produce more resources later. However, I wouldn't recommend using the campaign as a tutorial for the multiplayer. Matches play similarly, but the objectives are different. You buy out the other players in multiplayer and skirmish, but you win campaign missions by building more colony modules in the AI. There's a tab on the top right to build various colony structures. Each costs a different resource, and there's a money cost on top of that, and they get more expensive as players start buying them. I find it kind of weird, and it can give you some bad habits if you decide to do this to train for multiplayer. Personally, I'd recommend running through the tutorials, then play enough skirmishes until you can beat the AI on an employee or manager difficulty consistently. The campaign happens in seasons. You and the different AI companies square off on different maps across the planet, and based on your performance across the different games, you get a stock price. The company with the lowest stock price at the end of each week gets eliminated. If you can last till the end, you play in a final game that plays like a standard skirmish. You have to buy out the other companies to finally win. The campaign is fun for a while, but there really isn't much there. There isn't any kind of grand narrative or special endgame that you're building towards, so if you're anything like me, it'll distract you for maybe a couple nights before you get bored of it. I'd say that's fine though. The main draw of this game is the multiplayer, and that's really where it shines. Unlike a lot of RTSs that can have matches lasting anywhere from 30-45 minutes to an hour or more, Offworld Trading Company matches are usually pretty quick. In fact, I'd say it can almost be too quick sometimes. Just as you're getting things together, the pink slip of death appears, and the weakest players typically are the first to go, as their companies are the cheapest to buy out. I wouldn't say that this punishes newer players necessarily. The game is usually advanced enough by this point that you're not really missing anything. Once players start to get bought out, you usually quickly get to the end game, which means two outcomes. One player steamrolls and buys everybody out, or two players end up going at it for a while. If you find yourself getting your ass kicked a lot, the game by default records all the games you play, so you can take a look if you want to get an idea of what went wrong. It's a nice little feature to include. One easy mistake to make is just to take the cost of resources to assume whether it's profitable or not. Electronics might get super expensive, but if the material to make it is also expensive, like carbon and silicon, you might not make as much as you imagined. Hold X to see the profitability of a building, but keep in mind that these can change over time. And this is really the challenge of the game. It's not hard to look at buildings and just pick the most profitable one, but you need to figure out what will stay profitable and what won't. If you're willing to shell out a bit more cash, Offworld Trading Company also has an expansion, Jupiter's Forge. This takes you to Jupiter's volcanic moon of Io and changes the main menu background to Jupiter and Io. Don't worry, you can change it back if you're more of a Marsophile. Io works a bit differently than Mars. There's a new resource for starters, uranium. Its main use is to power nuclear power plants, which replaces wind turbines. Water is also not available on the surface of Io like on Mars, so you need to build a water processor to make it out of oxygen and something else. I'm not a physicist. Playing on Io involves a lot more effort for life support and acquiring basic resources, which I'd say is appropriate considering the differences between Io and Mars. If you thought Mars was freezing cold, Io is almost 200 degrees colder, and on top of that it's also covered with supervolcanoes. Some benefit here though, as you can build a new structure, basalt platforms on basalt lakes, and then use power to produce uranium, silicon, and iron. The new planet, I guess technically a moon, isn't the only addition though. You also get two new companies to play with, the Nomads and the Elites, as well as a new campaign based on Io. For the factions, elites give bonuses to all the more specialized buildings, so that'd be the Hacker Array, Pleasure Dome, Offworld Market, Optimization Center, and Patent Lab, which makes them a bit more effective at manipulating and scheming their way to victory. That being said, they do have a resource advantage in that they can use silicon instead of aluminum when constructing buildings if it's cheaper. Guess for all those glass ceilings you'll be building. Nomads are an interesting one. They get 2 HQs they can place at the beginning of the game, and can return claims to get them back and use them again on different spots. For this reason I like these guys. They're great for shifting with the whims of the market. For instance, market for iron crashing, return those iron claims and invest in silicon or water or whatever. Now, before I conclude, I should mention that there's another expansion to Offworld Trading Company that adds Ceres to the game, which technically did come out about a year before Jupiter's Forge. Now, I don't actually own the Ceres DLC, so I'm not an expert on it, but considering it has a whole 3 user reviews on Steam, I'm guessing I'm far from the only one. This expansion actually started a lot of the changes that Jupiter's Forge includes, such as the uranium resource, resources slowly depleting on the map, and nuclear power plants. However, it doesn't add any new factions, so unless you are a total fanatic for this game, I'd probably stick with the original version and maybe Jupiter's Forge if you find yourself really into it. There's a lot of other DLCs too available on Steam that add various other features to the game, things like new abilities or different game modes. At full price though, you're setting yourself back about $40 if you want all the DLCs and expansions, and that's on top of the $20 you'll already be spending just getting the game itself, and that's still not including the $10 they're asking for the soundtrack DLC. So if you want to, there's a lot of stuff you can add if you get bored of the base game, but if you just want to try it out, just buy the game, and maybe grab Jupiter's Forge if it's on sale. Other than that, I can really only recommend the other stuff if you're really into the game and want to support the developers. They're currently working on 10 Crowns, which they describe as an epic-scale turn-based strategy game with a historical setting. It doesn't sound like it'll be much like Offworld, and considering Mohawk Games is led by the head designer of Civilization 4, I'd guess it'll probably bear more similarities to a traditional 4X game than an economic RTS like Offworld. Still though, I'm interested to see how that game turns out. I haven't been able to track down any estimates on a release date yet, so it might be a little while still. Well, that about wraps up my thoughts on Offworld Trading Company. Be sure to post a comment if there's anything you thought I missed, or just want to let me know what you think of the game too. Thanks for watching, guys.